But it's good to see you all here. Make yourself comfortable. Right, folks. Well, I'll be taking over some of Julia's role here today, which of course will be about letting you know, first of all, about what it is that's cropping up over the next few weeks. So I am just going to basically share my screen, which hopefully you are going to see. In that particular respect, taking you to the homepage on the SDS site. So next week, for those of you that came along to the Free Thursday a few weeks ago, we've actually got the training that's actually occurring on generalized anxiety disorder, a 2-day course which is occurring next week, folks. I understand there are still some places available on it, and I probably would ensure as well, or expect that Polina will just pop something into the chat box giving you a link if you are interested in that and want to sign up for it. There's still some time to do so. On the 2nd of May, which again, I think is that next week? No, it's not next week, it's the week after. But on the 2nd of May, we're doing one of our first return to the room trainings, which we've done since the pandemic. We decided that we would just test what the waters were like in terms of in the room training. This is in London at the British Psychological Society. I have to say that although I'm mentioning it to you now, it's been fully booked for ages. So there are no places available on that, I'm afraid. But it's just to let you know that we are at least testing the waters about returning to the room for at least some of the training that we actually are running. And then, of course, on the 9th of May, we have our course on motivational interviewing and beyond, which today's Free Thursday relates to, basically. So I hope that you're going to find the meeting now stimulating and encouraging, and basically that it will encourage you to sign up for the full 2-day event. All of these are obviously straightforward. Equally, if you want to know what's also coming up in the near future with regards to our Free Thursdays, then you can see just over here on the right-hand side of the screen where it says SDS Free Thursdays. You'll be able to identify those. And for anyone that has done any CBT training with us before, you get automatic free access to our SDS tutorials. So that applies to certain topic areas. It primarily tends to apply to any CBT training, but we've also done it as well for instances with any people that have been on the child and adolescent courses that we run as well. We will send out periodic tutorial notifications for anyone that has done work in one of those modules or certificates as well. So, yep, that is probably all that I wanted to do at the moment in terms of sharing about what's coming up. And to basically say, let's dive in to things today. So after our success, well, what we thought was a success anyway, of using a poll as a springboard, really, for discussion and presentation on one of our Free Thursdays, that we're going to do the same again today. So it will be a much more interactive meeting today, folks, which I strongly encourage you when we put up our polls to please contribute to. I appreciate we're not going to get 100% of people there. I don't quite know why. Maybe some people have got their mouse hand frozen when it actually comes to the questions. But, you know, this is not a test, can I hasten to add. It's a springboard for discussion. But we thought that we would do that. And we're going to start off, probably not that surprisingly, really, I think, with just getting some idea about what your knowledge or experience actually is of motivational interviewing. So just to set the scene for this and to set the scene for the training that's coming up at the beginning of next month, we are running our certificate in resource-based therapies, which has 3 component parts to it. We have one that is related to solution-focused therapy, which has already run in its live form, but a recording is available for you if you actually have missed that and you want to complete the whole certificate, which is BPS approved. You can still access it in a recorded form. But the one, obviously the second one that we're running, which is occurring at the beginning of next month, is the one on, on motivational interviewing and beyond. I'll say a little bit about the beyond bit in a minute. And the third one, which will be occurring in the subsequent month, is on positive psychotherapy, which is about the application of positive psychology to the psychotherapy field as well. So that's the 3 modules. If I can say something very briefly about why we put these together, although obviously I say something more obviously at the beginning of each course. I personally have become increasingly concerned by the pathologized nature of the work that we do. A tendency to focus on some sort of what is broadly termed deficits model of human beings, which is that we have a focus on identifying and naming a particular problem that somebody actually has, and that the nature of the work that we do with them, in a sense, independent of what modality we work in, is to basically fill the gap in some way. It's to, in a sense, to get rid of that deficit. And that's done in all sorts of ways, although probably the most common way that tends to be used in psychotherapy tends to be some sort of skills-based model for filling the deficit. But it can, whether that's about teaching new skills in terms of managing emotion, or whether it's about providing advice or whatever, or in some modalities, it might be about trying to fill that deficit by maybe providing some sort of corrective relationship with the therapist or the counselor in order to actually achieve that. And one of my concerns about that is that we end up basically having quite a negative view of human beings, and we end up with a very distorted view about how we help people. So the resource-based therapies modules, which come together to produce the certificate, tend to have a very different approach to helping people basically change. First of all, they tend, in different ways, to focus on the idea of working with what people have going for them, what their resources, what their strengths are, rather than looking at repairing their deficits. So it's about, not just, I think, about taking their strengths, but it's almost by starting off from the assumption that people do have such strengths. There are also, I think, ways of approaching things which are, broadly speaking, what might be termed future-oriented. They're much more focused on where it is people are going to and where they want to go to, rather than where people have come from. So these tend, on the whole, to be approaches that have minimal interest, really, for instance, in people's histories, and certainly don't have an enormous interest in how the problem has developed or come into being, really. But they are quite focused on where it is that people want to get to. They're all fairly, I was going to say anti, I think that varies, that's too strong a term, but they're all at the very least rather agnostic about the classification of problems. So none of them actually see any real value in diagnosis. And in some particular instances, and I think this is an important point really, that's worth actually emphasizing here, is in some instances, they don't have a real worry at all if our clients have a very different view or definition of what their problem is from the one that we've got. So in that respect, when you remember that in a lot of modalities, a lot of our energy goes into trying to help the client to have insight or to own the problem in some particular way before they can move forward. None of those sort of issues are around. And I guess that for me is quite a big plus, because in a peculiar way, all of these approaches bypass a substantial number of sources of what is commonly perceived as resistance in clients, and finds another way around of being able to work with clients, which generally speaking, I would also have to say, because of the points I've actually made, I think is, I can't say in every single instance, but is certainly much more likely to lead the experience of therapy for the client to be a much more positive one. Now, I don't mean by that I'm suggesting that other types of therapy are negative. All I'm simply saying is it's much more common using these approaches to find clients leaving sessions feeling more optimistic from the session. And I can certainly honestly say I probably find more instances of clients smiling when these particular approaches are actually being used. And that the idea of change being hard work, for instance, is substantially diminished. So, and can I just say, although I've mentioned that in connection, obviously, with how clients, I think, experience this, not surprisingly, this also has an implication as well for how it leaves us feeling when we've been working with clients. So I would also happily say I think that this tends to raise the mood of practitioners as well as raising the mood of clients. So that's why we put all of this together, really. And obviously this particular module is on motivational interviewing and beyond. I'll say, as I say, I'll say something about the beyond bit in a minute, but I thought it would be useful just to start off here, just to get some idea about what your familiarity is or isn't at all with motivational interviewing. So Polina will put up the first poll for you question on this. You've obviously got three choices here, folks. Motivational interviewing, or MI as it's commonly called, is something which you either feel familiar with, either regarding its basics or maybe its more advanced use. You've heard of it, but only have a vague idea about it, and don't really incorporate it into your work. And finally, have not actually come across it before. Just so we've got some sense of where you're at with this. We still have potentially about, what is it we got here? 12 people still to vote, folks. If you have not voted in one of these, it will be a real plus if you could, just so we can get as full a picture as possible about where you're at with this. Well, we've not done badly there. We're up to a reasonable number there. So I will just end that poll and share the results with you, just so you can see these. So about nearly just under 2/3 of you basically have heard of it, but have only really got a vague idea about it. Around about 1/3 of you have got some familiarity about it, either in terms of its basics or its advanced state, and just under 10% of you have not come across it before. So I'll just stop the sharing on that. I'm going to say something very briefly on this because I don't want to take up too much time on this. But it is an approach which was originally developed probably in fairness about the mid to late 1980s, but probably only came on the scene and became visible probably in the very early 90s by two clinical psychologists, Bill Miller, who is American and I think is probably retired now, but was based at the University of New Mexico. But actually at the time when he developed this was doing a research job in Norway, I think it was, specifically on working with alcohol problems. And Steve Rolnick, a South African clinical psychologist, but based at the University of Wales in Cardiff, who was much more interested in things like GP communication, general health problems, and so on and so forth. But for slightly different reasons, they were interested in the issue of client motivation, and probably much more honestly, really, were interested in why clients were not motivated to actually make changes, and that they developed this particular approach off the back of that. And it's probably become a mainstay of, or at least the very starting point of working with folks who demonstrate, for want of a better term, low levels of motivation in therapy, which I appreciate, covers quite a wide spectrum. I guess one of the most common things that you may well come across are people with low self-esteem, low self-efficacy, low mood, who would like to make a change, but basically just can't get their act together. And then, of course, there's other folks that we might be working with where their motivation and commitment in therapy waxes and wanes according to various things that are going on. And then, of course, at the other end of the spectrum, we have, of course, folks who either don't think they've got a problem at all, so they're seeing us because they've been pressurized to see us, maybe by family members, maybe they've been mandated by the courts, maybe they're coming along to keep somebody else happy. We've got a very good example of that with someone that I'm working with at the moment. So there's a whole range of ways in which that can occur, or simply that, we're working with someone who finds therapy basically just hard work, really, and progress appears to be slow. So that's the sort of context in which it was developed, and is still seen as being the mainstay or baseline or first approach to be incorporating into work when you're dealing with people who are sort of poorly motivated in some way. The second question that I wanted to ask you is not going to come up as a poll. I'm going to ask you this verbally, and I'm going to ask you to pop your thoughts into the chat box, folks. So hopefully you all found or know where the chat box actually is. But what I wanted to ask you was this, to indicate in the chat box what you currently usually do when you have a client who is showing signs of poor motivation in therapy, either regarding therapy itself or maybe about personal change generally. And I'm sure all of us have come across clients, who have got at least some difficulties with being motivated. And I'm just interested in what is it that you do now? If this client came along tomorrow or this afternoon, what's your sort of default approach to trying to work with somebody whose motivation is not as it might? So let's just have a look at some of the answers that we're already getting to. Vicky says, I would check their readiness for change. So the changes of stages of change model. Alyssa says, explore any ambivalence barriers. Joanne, try to get to the bottom of what's stopping them moving forward. Laura, work on building a relationship with them. Ask them what their goals are, build a rapport, stay with them. Ask what life would look like with the change. Encourage them to break things down to smaller steps. I would usually find out what is a blocker to homework compliance, if that was an issue, and we could discuss it. prompting questions of how it would look if they don't change. Cultivate a safe place. Use some, Elizabeth says, use some solution-focused questions. What would life be like without the challenges and problems, and so on and so forth. Yes, Philip says, I'd aim to find something that they have changed and look at how they made it. So look at past success and think about how they're doing. And all of those, can I just say, are undoubtedly valuable and useful strategies to use. What I think, to be honest with you, is one of the biggest difficulties or dangers that's around with working with poor motivation in inverted commas is, I think there's a couple of potential problems. One of them undoubtedly is to be a practitioner with a toolbox which has only got one tool in it. You know, it's the problem of only having a hammer, which is that, you know, you treat everything as if it's a nail. So what I would say is that, you know, I wouldn't ever say to you, give up your default approach, at least not in most instances. But what I would certainly encourage you to do would be to have a broader repertoire of responses and ways in which you can respond to poor motivation. And that's obviously what, you know, motivational interviewing is designed to do. And I would also add, by the way, the solution-focused training that we looked at for those who came along to it, to the previous training on, but which is still available as a recording, also does as well. It provides a wider range of questions, or a wider range of approaches. The other great danger, which I'm not seeing anybody sort of admit to, but I'll put money on the fact that at least some of you actually use, if only, can I say, because it's such a human response when you're confronted with someone who's not moving and where your aim is to try and help them to move, which is to slide into persuasion mode, And what does that mean? Well, it's about being almost inevitably more didactic. It almost inevitably tends to mean as well that our tone and attitude and responses as well to clients tend to be different. And I think, in a strange way, one of the other dangers with it is that apart from potentially escalating, and we sort of know that, don't we? We sort of know in the back of our minds that it does actually escalate resistance. You know that if you're saying to someone, I can't do this, or I don't believe it, or I can't see the purpose of it, if someone comes back heavily and tries to persuade us that we can, actually what it tends to do is it amplifies that resistance. But the other thing it does, which I think you've got to be really careful about, particularly if you're sliding into it and not even fully aware of the fact you're sliding into it, is that you're actually getting into a form of dichotomous thinking, which is, I've really got to push this to get a result, which then implies, if it's not getting a result, what do you do? And the great danger at that particular point is that either you decide, or can I just say, it could be your client who decides that actually they want to disengage altogether. So the client decides not to come back. And we say to ourselves, I knew they weren't ready to change yet. I knew they weren't ready to change yet. Or maybe we decide that and inform the client. And we say, I don't think the time's quite right for you for therapy at the moment. Or I don't think we're going to be able to get any further. And actually what I would want to say here is, I think that's in a strange way about a creation of a dynamic, intentionally, unintentionally, and also some pre-existing assumptions about what it's about when somebody doesn't change or isn't willing to comply in some particular way. And I think that one of the many things that motivational interviewing says and does really is that it emphasizes the idea that motivation is not a client personality characteristic. It's not It's not viewed primarily as something which is internal to the client. It's actually seen as something which is at least 50% the product of what is going on between the therapist and the client. And at a sort of an intuitive level, I suspect that we know this is the case. We probably have had the experience ourselves, if we've ever been in therapy, for instance, that there's just been some therapists that somehow or other we gelled with and another one we didn't. You may have had that experience with supervisors as well, by the way, that you have a supervisor that you really feel that there's some sort of good working relationship with, and it gels, and somebody that there isn't. You may well have had that experience at school, even with teachers, that your ability to do something or to engage in something was clearly a product of something that one teacher did, which another one didn't. So I think that's one of the things that MI has sort of contributed to it. But what I wanted to move on to was to move on to the next question, question 3, which, if you can pop that up, please, for us, Helena. Can motivational interviewing work with clients who either don't agree with your definition of the problem, or maybe don't even think that they have a problem? Or do you need to have a different approach? Is this basically something which is usable with people who at least think they've got a problem, but maybe are unsure about whether they can do something about it? But actually, you at least need to have a client who's sort of got that degree of engagement, of recognizing that they've got a problem and would like to do something about it, even though they wonder if it's possible, or maybe it's not that important, etc. Or do you think it needs something totally different? And there's 3 options here. Yes, it can work. No, it needs a totally different approach, and a bit of both. Gosh, and we've got a real tussle and tuggle going on. I don't know if tuggle's a word, but tussle that's going on here between yes, it can work, and a bit of both is occurring at the moment. Not a single vote for a totally different approach. I'm going to carry on, just give you a couple more seconds, folks. John says, does it depend on how we define work? No, when I say work, I mean engage with therapy and demonstrate, or able to demonstrate, some evidence of change. So, well, anyway, it looks like, yes, Tara says, when patients argue against change, one of the principles of MI is to roll with resistance. So let's go with what you've actually got here. Got slightly fewer responses on this, unfortunately, but there we go. So there we go. If we end and share the results on this, as you will see, just under 2/3 are saying a bit of both, and just over 40% of you are saying yes, it can work. I'm going to basically opt for a bit of both on this, because although obviously we're running a day entitled Motivational Interviewing Beyond, it's one of the reasons that I wanted the Beyond bit in it, really, because I think that there are some things which MI is particularly strong on, and there's others which it, generally speaking, has less to say on, is probably a better way of actually putting it. I think that's one of the reasons. And the other reason has to do with something relating to psychology generally, which I'll mention in a moment. But let me just say a couple of the areas where I think MI has not said an enormous amount on. So I think that one thing, by the way, that Miller and Rolnick always want to make very clear is that motivational interviewing doesn't have anything at all to do with the stages of change model. although the two are often taught together, they like to make it quite clear they come from different sources and one is not dependent on the other at all. But having said that, if you actually look at the stages of change model, which for those of you who are familiar with it will know what I'm talking about. For those that are not familiar with it, we will be having a brief look at it on the training day. I think that generally speaking, that MI has tended to focus on people who are at that ambivalence stage. People who sort of think they've got a problem, maybe would like to do something about it, maybe sometimes think they can, maybe they can't, or maybe think that now's not a good time, but at least they sort of recognize they have some sort of problem, but they're feeling very ambivalent about addressing it. But what I don't think it has a lot to say on at all is what are called pre-contemplators, first of all. And pre-contemplators are, they cover a number of folk. They cover, first of all, people who don't think they've got a problem at all. So these will almost invariably, by the way, be people who you're seeing solely because they've been mandated or pressurized or sent to see you. But it also covers people who think they've got a problem, but have absolutely no intention or belief in their ability to change it. You know, if I can take a general medical example of obesity, for instance, which is quite a good illustration, I think, of this particular approach. I can think of working with a number of obese patients over the years who would always say, everyone in our family is like this. They always have been and they always will be. It's genetic. And do they even think that it's a problem? They may or may not think it's a problem, but they have absolutely no inclination to view it as something that's changeable. It's a fixed, it's who they are in that particular. I've also probably come across this as well, though less commonly, with certain offenders. I'm a bad lad. I always have been. I always will be. That sort of thinking. So they don't really see it as a changeable problem. And then there's another group who sort of see it as a problem and believe that change is possible, but the change doesn't relate to them. So these will be people who have a tendency to blame, in inverted commas, their problem on a third party. You know, and they'll say things like, it shouldn't be me that you should be working with, it should be so-and-so. I would say that that's pretty common amongst perpetrators of domestic violence I've worked with, for instance, who will be saying to me, well, you ought to be working with my nagging partner, not me. I wouldn't be like this if she wasn't like that, in inverted commas. But, you know, you'll come across people who will say if it wasn't for the government, if it wasn't for the NHS, if it wasn't for whatever, this problem wouldn't be existing, if it wasn't for my parents or whatever. So they're all pre-contemplators. And I don't think, on the whole, that motivational interviewing in its pure form has a lot to say to those folks. And I largely, can I say, for those of you that worked with me before will know this, but for those of you who haven't, I have a long-standing interest in extremely poorly motivated clients. And I would say probably about 2/3 of the clients that I actually see are mandated to see me. So they don't come along voluntarily. So in that respect, I've always been particularly interested in how do you work with someone? How do you work with someone who they're only in the room, basically, because someone's made them be in the room? And that can range from people who won't even talk to you, can I say, through to the other groups that I've just mentioned. So that's part of the beyond bit that we'll be looking at during the day, which takes us beyond motivational interviewing. And the other bit that I think MI doesn't say a great deal on, and oddly enough, I've just been recently reading a particular book that's just come out on this, which is MI has really not said an enormous amount on dealing with maintenance of change. And maintenance is undoubtedly the big unresearched area of motivation. You know, we all tend to operate on some sort of acute model of change. We do something with someone, and if it works, great, and we wave goodbye. But we ignore the fact, for instance, that relapse frequently occurs. In fact, I was looking at data on this actually, and I was quite taken aback by, although time spans vary, I was quite taken aback by the consistency of the degree of relapse that occurs with a whole range of problems, ranging from depression through to weight loss. And within a 5-year period, relapse for all of these problems tends to be around about 50%, whatever type of interventions being used. Sorry, I should make this clear, not when I say whatever type of intervention that's used. This is people who have successfully changed as a result of an intervention with these problems, but within 5 years' time, you have nearly a 50% instance of where relapse has occurred. Might not be ongoing, can I say? It might be a period of relapse and then recovery. So we might be talking about repeated periods. But you know, the idea of maintaining a change is clearly a big issue, whatever types of problems we're dealing with. And very little to say on that. And certainly from an MI perspective, and I will be sharing with you a whole range of strategies which are really well established and research based about how to help clients maintain change. And that we'll be looking at that in the 2-day course as well. And it just doesn't get addressed. We're also caught up with the urgency question. You know, if you're working for an organization, the issue here is get to see them quickly. Urgency is you know, most organizations don't have an enormous interest in maintenance. They just say, well, if it goes wrong again after a period of time, at least they're okay for a period, and we can always see them again if they come back. But actually, I think maintenance is a real big issue. There's a American comedian, Bob Newhart, who I often quote on this, who talks about this issue in connection with cigarette smoking. He actually said cigarette smoking is very easy. Giving up cigarette smoking is very easy. I've done it on numerous occasions. And I think that for so many people, that can be a description of both mental health problems and also health behavior problems and also social problems, behavioral problems that they actually have as well. So we will be looking at, that's another area which I don't think MI has had a lot to say on, although it does recognize the fact that it's an important area, but it's still the case that there's not really much research that's been done on using it in that context. The other area, which I find staggering, is not used, is that, you know, motivation as a concept is not unique to the therapy and counseling field, for goodness sake. Motivation has been of interest in the psychology field across a whole range of other areas. I mean, occupational psychology, not surprisingly, has had a really big interest in the whole question of motivation as it applies to employment, for instance. But it's actually one of the key basic concepts within general psychology. And there's a whole range of well-established research-based principles which basically help people to be more motivated, which are totally typically ignored within the motivation within therapy field. And again, I will be sharing some of those with you during the 2-day course. So I'll just stop my sharing on that because I'm also suddenly very aware of the fact that time is trotting on here. So question number 4, Helena, if you can pop this one up. Which of the following was the biggest influence on the developers of MI, motivational interviewing? CBT, Rogerian client-centered therapy, narrative therapy, or all of the above? Oh, this is much more spread out. This is I should have mentioned to you before you started answering this, that this is a carefully worded question, by the way. Carefully worded question. It doesn't actually say, oh, mind you, I won't say anything more because we've still only got 41. Folks, can I just say, even if you haven't got a clue, give us an answer. You've got a 25% chance of getting it right. There we go. There's a few more that have come in there. Okie dokie. Right, I'll just stop that because of time and share the results on this one. So, well, the single largest group, just over a third of you, decided to go for the safe option of saying, well, maybe it's all of them. But can I just say the question was, which of the following was the biggest influence? So I guess the implication of that question, of your answer there, is I think that they all were equally influential on the development of MI. So we've got around about 30% each, near enough, saying it was CBT and Rogerian client-centered therapy, and under 10% saying narrative therapy. Well, undoubtedly the biggest influence on this was Rogerian client-centered therapy, which I think surprises a lot of people in many ways, because MI is a very research evidence-based approach. Both Miller and Rolnick, in terms of the interventions that they would be advocating at what in a stages of change model would be seen as the action stage, would typically be CBT, simply because it's also so evidence-based. But interestingly enough, it did not influence Bill Miller's thinking primarily. Top of the list, Bill Miller says that influenced his thinking in terms of the way in which he approached it. And I'll say a little bit about how this approach has influenced his thinking, was actually Rogerian therapy. And Rogers was a big influence on his thinking. And to a slightly, well, substantially lesser degree, is the use of narrative therapy as well. Don't forget, by the way, Bill Miller originally came from work in the addictions field, where, you know, the primary model on the whole tended to be advice giving, or maybe, you know, something like controlled drinking, or, you know, 10-step program, or whatever it actually is, rather than CBT, which might be a reason for it. But let me just say something about this, because I think this is quite an important point to make. And I'll contrast it particularly with CBT, I think. MI has a tendency to view what is occurring in what's occurring between the practitioner and the client as being quite fluid, and it has a flow model of communication. It's not especially structured. It certainly doesn't have a protocol. So in that particular way, it's quite different, I think, from some of the underlying values in CBT. And I speak here primarily as a CBT practitioner. And I think it's interesting to just have a think about what that's about and how that developed. And I think it does come from the fact that Bill Miller was working primarily with basically what he would term at the time as being alcoholics, which was engaging them was notoriously difficult. So actually, you couldn't ever necessarily have them to come along for a weekly session, because they just wouldn't do it. So they just did not respond well to something which was highly structured at the beginning at all. And I think that was one of the key reasons why something which is more fluid was originally adopted. I think the other thing that he took specifically from Rogers which is not absent, can I say, in CBT, but is probably just not emphasized as much, is that he was very interested in Roger's emphasis on the client's perspective of the problem, the client's perspective of where they wanted to go to. And that is certainly very central within motivational interviewing. Now, I don't want to say that's absent from CBT, because it's not. And I would say it's probably one of the key roles that Socratic questioning plays, for instance, within CBT. But I don't think it's quite the center stage as it tends to be here within MI. So that raises a really interesting issue, really, which is about using a more fluid approach, and how that fits if the main work that you're doing is actually more structured. Now, I've mentioned this in connection with CBT, but it also, can I say, sort of comes up with other types of work. So if any of you, for instance, are working and doing something which involves a protocol or a set series of interventions. I'm doing some work next week with a group of dietitians, for instance, and not on MI, but dietetics comes immediately to mind for that reason, where there will be specific advice or specific information that's given and a particular structure for how to actually approach a problem. And I think that raises some interesting questions about how do you fit MI with this. But the other thing I would want to emphasize is it raises a really interesting question as well about how do you fit in something like this with that structured approach? Does it work? Does it not? Does it come together? Or if you approach things from, for instance, a primarily Rogerian perspective, as I suspect a number of you do, then how is MI different from a client-centered approach to therapy? Because I would argue strongly that it is, and although it is collaborative, I would argue quite strongly it is also directive. And I'll come back to that particular point, obviously, in terms of what the difference is. Because probably if you were to ask an MI practitioner, how or why don't they just use a Rogerian approach with a poorly motivated client, I think that they would probably say, because there's no clear focus to where you're trying to go with it, one of the great dangers is you go round in circles. And that actually, if you're solely looking at the client's experience, what you can do is you can end up colluding with the client's distress, you can end up colluding with the client's chaos, and you end up feeling as stuck as the client does. So it's both very influenced by Rogerian work, but also different from it. And I think I've sort of given an answer really with regards to the next poll question, but we'll put it up anyway, Paulina, about which of the following has MI said the least about. I've obviously given the a partial answer to this, but what do you think this has said the least about? The client's reasons for wanting change, how to maintain change once you've started, what the therapist should be doing to increase client motivation rather than what the client should be doing, and the way in which questions should be phrased to increase client motivation. And my goodness, well, I say the results are not that surprising, but actually they are increasingly turning out to be surprising, which is very interesting. Right, I'll just end the poll at that particular point, although numbers are not as high, and share the results on this. So folks, obviously the most common reason that people have given is how to maintain change once you've started, which is the issue that that I've just raised earlier. But this is very interesting here, that nearly a third of you are saying what the therapist should be doing to increase client motivation rather than what the client should be doing. That is just not true. Basically, MI is all about seeing motivation as basically being a product of the relationship between the practitioner and the client. I don't just mean things like empathy and rapport. It's much more specific than that. But basically, the way that the practitioner conducts the session substantially influences whether the client is motivated or not motivated. And it really largely it's really focused almost exclusively on making sure that we as practitioners are doing the right things in order to increase client motivation, not what the client should be doing. And it strikes me as being quite reasonable that that should be the case, can I hasten to add, because we're the ones that are supposed to be the trained ones, the ones that have got a broader toolkit than our clients have got in terms of how to get out of stuck positions and whatever. So, you know, we all know, don't we, that we've got more control over our own behavior than over the behavior of others. And this same principle applies here as well. The other areas actually, can I say, are equally an issue. That there's lots of stuff within MI about how questions should be phrased. Very interested indeed, absolutely fundamentally interested in the client's reasons for wanting change. In fact, I will be building on that quite a lot in the 2-day course, because I actually think, although motivational interviewing says more about it than practically every other modality, I still think there are things, some basic things that it tends to leave out, which I'll be adding into the mix really, which actually are central to actually making a change. So I will stop sharing that one. Okay. And our final poll question, please, Polina. Which of the following has MI got a key role in regarding its use of, with specifically CBT here, with psychoeducation, with therapy engagement or attendance, completion of homework, practice tasks, or all of the above? Which of these would you say it's got a key role with regards to being used? Carry on voting, folks. I know that you are suffering from voting fatigue at this point in time in the course of this hour, but let's just try and nudge it up to 40. Just need a couple more folks just to vote on this. If you haven't voted, just a couple of you, if you can move your hand to actually doing that. But it's there we go, fantastic. Last minute burst of either anxiety or guilt led people to actually vote there, which is great. So we're going to end that particular poll and share the results on this. Now, what is really, I mean, the correct answer in inverted commas is all of the above, in fact. But what's quite interesting about this is the most obvious area for applying this, not just within CBT, but in any type of help where you are giving information. I don't know how many of you are involved in information giving or signposting, or giving advice or problem solving for the client. I don't know if any of you are actually sort of involved in using any of those sorts of interventions. But actually, just like psychoeducation, it's probably the area where you can get your biggest bang for your buck using motivational interviewing. And indeed, this is where it originated from, because Bill Miller was so fed up with working with his clients who had alcohol problems, where he would be giving them information in many instances about how to drink more safely, how to control their drinking, how to manage their lifestyle so they didn't get so tempted to drink. And he was just forever struck by people who, first of all, and I think this is a really interesting point, first of all, basically already knew this, but they just didn't do it. Or people who said yes in the session and then never did it afterwards, which I'm sure you all must have had experience of. There are, in my opinion, some other big issues that are around, particularly with psychoeducation, which have never still, in my opinion, been fully grasped within the CBT field. So for those of you with the CBT background, let me very rapidly just go through what these are, because they are an issue. We have got research evidence going back at least over 30 years, which indicates that written and printed information of both a health and psychoeducational nature is written at a reading age which is not understood by 1/3 of the people receiving it. And I can't go into more detail about this now because we haven't got time, but basically, you know, you're handing stuff out, and even if you're reading it out to people, they haven't got a clue what the hell it means. It's just not phrased correctly. So that's one particular issue. Secondly, we've got a big problem with the fact that we are swamped with information. Swamped with information. A large number of your clients will have already been on the net to get information regarding their problem before they start seeing you. And there's a real issue about how you, in inverted commas, how you make your information stand out from the crowd of other information. And also, why the hell should I believe you rather than this very interesting, charismatic character with their own website, or, can I hasten to add, which is another major source, my peer group or family who give me information. Now, so there's a whole issue around here, and I think MI, in all sorts of ways, totally bypasses that problem. It embraces the value of information giving, and to some degree, it embraces the value as well of, in some contexts, giving advice. But it approaches it in a totally and utterly different way, in a way which I can guarantee, if you've not used these before, will substantially maximize and increase the chances of clients not just listening to, not just understanding, but also acting on the particular information that's given. So folks, I hope I leave that carrot dangling in front of you as something which will tempt you to sign up on the Motivational Interviewing course, a 2-day course, I think starting on the 9th of May. But again, Paulina's kindly put up the link for that that's actually there. But apart from that, I will say take care. See you again soon. Look out for our next free Thursday, and hopefully, at least, see some of you on the Motivational Interviewing and Beyond course. So you can take care, folks. Feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd like to. So take care. Look after yourselves now.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.